So if you don't see this card or this card throughout the video, then that's because I do not own the card. I tend to use cards that I own and not cards that I want. It's my personal policy. All of that, all the names of my opponents will be blacked out, so you'll only see my username. On to the video. To whoever I played up against here, just good job, wonderful, Galaxy Brain play here, 10 out of 10, good moment.
Now that's a lot of damage!
we are again. Since the last video did so well, I figured I'd start doing another one of these. As per usual, I won't be talking about the 3-ofs for this deck that you'll always want. So that will leave out Salamangreat Circle, Salamangreat Foxy, Salamangreat Gazelle, and Salamangreat Spiny, however you say it, the Spin Boy. Let me talk about a card that's a bit debatable for me in this deck. That is Lady Debug. Why is Lady Debug so debatable for me in this deck? Well, it's mainly because it's not a Salamangreat monster in name. Sure, it's a good Stratos for all Cyberse decks, especially Salamangreats. But it's also bad in Salamangreats because it's not a Salamangreat monster, meaning that if you send Lady Debug to the graveyard for a Balinx, you cannot protect Balinx's effect by chain-linking Gazelle's effect. Normally what you would do is send a Salamangreat monster, such as Spiny or Foxy, to the graveyard for Balinx, and then you could use Gazelle's effect to protect Balinx from getting Ash Blossomed and Joyous Springs. But because you're sending Lady Debug to the graveyard for Balinx, you cannot protect it from Ash Blossom and Joyous Springs. What happens if Balinx's effect gets Ash Blossom and Joyous Springs? Well, that means you can't add Salamangreat Sanctuary to your hand. And Salamangreat Sanctuary is basically the heart and soul of this deck. If this card is gone, kaput, whatever you call it, for basically deceased, then you have major problems on your hands, such as not being able to get off reincarnation effects, such as Salamangreat Wolf's effect to add a spell or trap from grave to hand. This is really important for the Salamangreat strategy, because you usually send off of Gazelle's effect either Salamangreat Roar or Salamangreat Rage. And those two cards are useful for this deck. But because, again, if Balinx gets Ash Blossom and Joyous Springs, you're going to have to spend either more resources to get to this effect, or you won't be able to get to the effect at all. And that is a bad situation to be in. Let's mosey along on to Jack Jaguar for this deck. Now then, it's fairly simple. Just run one or two of him based on your preference. If you feel like you draw him too much, and you feel like that's the only card in your deck that you need to have in your deck, I would suggest running two, so that yes, if you draw one, it's not the end of the world, and you can still special summon one off of Mirage Stalio's effect. But if you feel as if you are confident in your deck, you know you're not going to hard draw it, and you know you're going to be in a good situation where Jack Jaguar will be able to always be summoned out by Mirage Stalio, then I would suggest only running one of this in your deck. Now then, for hand traps, don't run more than 3 different hand traps. What hand traps do I suggest running? Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. This card you get in the structure deck. No reason not to run it. Then there's Effect Veiler. This card is infinite impermanence, but it targets. That's important. Remember this if monsters cannot be targeted by effects. And DD Crow. This card is good in the mirror match if they send a card that they're going to need to the graveyard off of Gazelle's effect. After Gazelle's effect resolves, just banish whatever they send to the graveyard. Other hand traps you may be considering for this deck would be Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit. It's perfect for almost every situation, but there are some situations where it's not that good in. Then there is Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. This card is wonderful in the mirror match for just getting rid of all the Sunlight Wolves. Next up, let's talk about Fusion of Fire. Now then, this card, I would say run based on your preference, whether you want it at 1 or whether you want it at 3. This card is really good, especially in mirror matches or in situations where your opponent has a Link monster, because you can basically super poly away a Link monster that's annoying, such as, let's say, Nightmare Unicorn. You can super poly that away. A monster such as Rusty Bardage, you can poly that away. Summon Sorceress, you can poly that away. Get it, good. Another card I would suggest you run is Pot of Desires. Now then, here's the thing with Pot of Desires. You got to remember that you could potentially banish away a piece that you need, such as Jack Jaguar, such as the Field Spell, such as both of the traps in some instances. So if you run Pot of Desires, make room in your deck so that you can run 2 of each copy of a card you usually run 1 of, just in case. One card I'm going to suggest running based on your preference is Will of the Salamangreat. Why that card? It's basically an archetypal monster reborn. Like, there's no good situation why you shouldn't be running 3 of this. But again, this is also based on your preference. So if you don't feel like you need the graveyard recursion, and you feel like your deck is doing good enough, then I would suggest swapping this out with something else that you feel like will fit better for the deck. I would suggest you run this card based on how much the meta is heavily reliant on either Spell Trap removal or Ash Blossom and Joyous Brains. If it's not heavily reliant on those 2 cards, run 1 Salamangreat Sanctuary in your deck. If it is heavily reliant on those cards, run 2 or 3 depending on your preference. Speaking of cards you might want to run based on your metagame, I would suggest you run number 41, Baguska. Why him? Mainly for the defense position negation effect. Anything that is not a heavily focused Link deck, I would suggest running Baguska almost at every time that you can summon him. He's a really good stall monster, and he can prevent some monsters from getting off their effects. So that is really useful. If you are a madman like me, you can run Kaijus in the main deck if you feel like you need some card space to be filled in with a card that you don't know what you need to put in there. But if you have all the cards that you need in your deck and such, I would suggest actually running Kaijus in the side deck. Just because you never know if you're going to need a non-targeting, non-destruction removal for the deck. And Kaijus are usually a good way to go. Now then, here are 2 different deck profiles I would suggest. This is a deck profile I would suggest if you're extremely on budget and don't have the money to afford certain hand traps and you feel as if you need deck space in your deck. But if you don't feel like you need deck space in your deck, I would actually suggest this version of the deck. It's much better and much more consistent, and from my experience, a lot easier to pull off some things. This has been Ice, signing out for the day. Please do make sure to like this video, share it around if you can on the internet, and please do comment down below. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this deck.